there was a big chunk of the book that was dedicated to a group of intellectuals that you called the Realists.
Yeah, I want to.
Who were they? Who did, and like what made you settle on them?
So Hans Morgenthau is the he's a realist. He's like
Yeah.
the realist in some ways of that moment. So he's one. But then, and George Kennan is also, kind of an obvious choice if you're just looking like you can't avoid him, and I didn't want to avoid him. He's an interesting figure. So he's already complicating the meaning of and the label realism, but I use him. And then the third is Reinhold Niebuhr. He had kind of come up with this notion of Christian realism. So realism definitely works for Niebuhr, although he's you tell me, but in like what I read of the IR realist discussion, like I don't see his name that much. Obama gave him a little boost, but it's kind of like he faded out. I don't feel like people really read him. And then the third is the most shoehorned in there because I love her. Who is Hannah Arendt. That was one of those moments of like, oh, they're not going to let me keep Hannah in there, but she made it. So, I mean, she's more like, I don't know. I found some way to fit her in the label, but she's doing such interesting thinking. And I wanted to look at like these very strong texts that would bring the book out of just the China question per se, and I wanted to go deeper into, kind of the American mind, like the formation of this Cold War mentality. But this is through four of what I consider like the sharpest critics of that mentality. Like they're watching it form and they're deeply concerned about what they're seeing. I mean, I guess if I were going to push this, I would say like their texts are kind of misread, I think, in some ways. I think they're much more about their anxieties over the United States, whereas they're typically read, certainly like Origins of Totalitarianism is read as like explaining what's going on in, in the communist bloc or the Soviet world, and kind of looking at it, having this deeper history in imperialism and anti-Semitism. I'm not denying that, but I mean, same with Politics of Nations. Like Morgenthau is turning that on his American readers, I think, in a way that probably was a little uncomfortable at the time, and especially like they're emigres. They're coming out of like harrowing experiences, especially Arendt and Morgenthau, of like narrowly escaping the Holocaust.
Nazis, yeah.
But they are calling out. Niebuhr's the most, maybe not surprisingly, but he's the most direct. Like the irony of American history is like, here's the mirror, look at yourselves, and feel very uncomfortable with what I'm showing you.
So it's interesting. Your use of the phrase "the realists" is loose by like most people's standards, I think, in IR at least. But it's fair. I mean, what's funny is this can go in many directions. Like, what's funny is that like these realists have all these names have been co-opted by advocates of like the foreign policy establishment today. And that milieu is all liberal hegemony people today. Right. But the realists are to liberal hegemony as fucking MLK is to corporations. Like, you're celebrating a caricature, not you, like the establishment is celebrating a caricatured version of Kennan, of Morgenthau, of Arendt, of Niebuhr is not as celebrated, but like he's in there. But you're celebrating a version of these people that's caricatured in order to sell your own used cars or like to legitimize yourself or whatever. Right.
So I think they're appropriated by both the realists and the liberals or the liberal hegemonists. Kissinger's the one who really changes the meaning of realism in its American discourse and sucks it of the ethical core that I find there very clearly, like, well, especially in 3 of the 4. I don't know about Kennan, but the other 3. And that ethical core is a critical self-reflective one, which I think neither liberals nor realists really want to get into. Liberals don't like today. I mean, liberals don't like the self-reflective part. That's why I think they can't handle Niebuhr, because you can't avoid it in Niebuhr. It is so explicit. They don't like that. And realists don't like the ethical stuff, because they a lot of it, they want to practice a realism that is you know, kind of amoral, like it's just about power. The main argument they're trying to make, although sometimes it's more implicit than explicit, is America emerging as a superpower is a frightening thing for America. That, you know, it is a corrupting, in the kind of philosophical sense of corruption, it's a corrupting force for American life, and they're very worried.
The way I read you portraying them, and I think this is fair, even though it is challenging to people who've like read some of these authors superficially, it really is that like they are anti-primicists, they're anti-triumphalist, right? And that is what they are, anti-liberal to that extent, or like in that sense, only. And they really saw dangers in what we would call now like hegemonic projects, you know. And it wasn't that they were like isolationists, it wasn't that they were trying to like be anti-internationalist or something like that. It's that they had their own view about like the scope or the conditions for venturing out abroad, being very wary of like this triumphalist overreach type stuff.
The other thing, and here's where, I don't know, I can see in 30 years, if some PhD student, you know, comes across this book, they might be like, oh, this is such a like Trump era book. But we'll see how it holds up. What I found, again, with especially, this would be Arendt and Morgenthau, is, and there were hints of it with the other two, there's this German connection with all of them. And they're, you know, the lesson of Weimar Germany, and the fact that it was a democracy that gives birth to, I mean, that's fair, but that Hitler takes over, you know, that was very present in their minds. And again, that's shaping the way, that shapes their anxiety about the United States, because they didn't take it for granted. Like, I think their dose of exceptionalism was pretty weak, you know, and they didn't, they treasured what it was, but they also saw it as like much more fragile, I think, than a lot of the people around them. And so that has some obvious current relevance.
Yeah, it's interesting too, like you don't necessarily go here, but within the political climate of deep anti-communism, red baiting, in a climate of like McCarthyist kind of fear-mongering stuff, there's actually only a narrow space within political discourse where you can argue against a kind of primacist, like global empire position. I mean, like the deck was stacked in favor of like default Dean Achesonism, you know, and that, so like it took like a certain amount of political courage to stake out an alternative position and to be like consistent and vocal about it. But B, like they were among, I almost think it's not accidental that they were among some of the most influential thinkers of the day, because like surely everybody's not on board with fucking, you know, global primacy, preventive war posture on the other superpower. Like it was some heavily militarized shit, and it was scary as fuck. And there was not a lot of room to push back. But then you have these people who have street cred as anti-fascist, anti-communist, whatever, anti-totalitarians, and they're the ones who are sort of staking out that position and being like, look, there's another way here.